Hey everybody, welcome back to round 2 of the deconstruction of White Fragility by Rob and DiAngelo. I want to begin first and foremost, as always, by saying that this video series is not in any way, shape, or form an endorsement of actual racism or of any sort of white identity politics or anything of that nature. This is, in fact, simply a deconstruction of the views expressed by Rob and DiAngelo, which I feel are having a deleterious effect on racial progress in this country. I also want to emphasize that all copyrighted materials in this series are reproduced here for the purpose of commentary and criticism and education on matters of public interest and are therefore exempt from copyright claims under the Fair Use Doctrine. So, all of that said, we're going to be getting into two of Rob and DiAngelo's favorite punching bags, in philosophical punching bags, I should say, which is the idea of individuality and the idea of objectivity. So these are two things that come up very early in the book, and if you see me skipping over these things as they're repeated throughout the book, it's because at the end of the day, she doesn't have that many actual points, so there's no reason to readdress these topics every time they come up. Anyway, the first thing I want to do, though, is actually take the time to address viewer comments as they come in. And the first viewer comment I want to address is actually on my video I made called Rob and DiAngelo is Probably the Real Racist. And it comes from a guy, or a person, I guess, named Ken Corprew, who states, and the following, to clarify the vernacular, everything I'm about to read is what he says. And it'll become clear why I'm saying that. At 2 minutes 15 seconds, he states, it's not because of the inherent truth of the book that, parentheses, white, close parentheses, people are having these profoundly negative reactions to it. Dr. DiAngelo addresses this in her book. So the issue is not the truth, it's how many, open parentheses, white, close parentheses, people are dealing with the truth that is causing the problem. His statement reeks with white fragility. It reeks of it in his phrased statement. It's a given that people means white people, and that he becomes physically ill because the truth is so profound. Okay, so I keep having to emphasize parentheses because he keeps adding the word white to what I'm saying. No, I didn't mean white people. I just meant people. And that's the problem. The bigotry, the prejudice, the presumption, sir, is on your end, not mine. If I need to clarify that I mean white people, I will clarify that I mean white people. I meant people in general. The negative reaction that this book is generating is not limited to any one race. Now, the thing is, you bring up the fact that she's Dr. DiAngelo. Well, here's the thing. This book, the assertions that she makes in this book, are made apropos of nothing except her own opinion, derived from anecdotal evidence. This is not how you establish a scholarly basis of knowledge. She simply has assumed that every person who disagrees with her is suffering from this magical malady that she's made up, this idea of white fragility. And certainly people are going to have difficulty talking about racial topics. It's a very highly charged topic. It's waters that nobody on either side of the divide wants to really wade into, I don't think. And by that, to clarify, since he's making assumptions, by that I mean the divide between black and white people. I don't think that it's something that anyone really wants to wade into, knowing how thorny a path this really is, how difficult and treacherous a discussion that's going to be. So yeah, it's something that people are going to resist weighing into. The problem is that this is Rob and DiAngelo assuming that she knows what a vast sprawl of people are thinking apropos of nothing. And she likes to say in her speeches that as a sociologist, she's able to generalize. Well, sociologists are able to generalize when they actually document in a scientifically rigorous manner the overarching behaviors and behavioral patterns of groups of people over a period of time in a scientifically legitimate manner that she has not done. She has just decided that everyone who that everyone who disagrees with her is a fragile white person, and the fact that she's a doctor means that you don't get to disagree with her, means that she automatically knows what's best and you don't. This is childish, it is pathetic, and it is an insult to academia. Anyway, so no, and then also he becomes physically ill because the truth is so profound. You don't know why I was becoming physically ill trying to read the book. You don't know what was going on in my life, and I'm going to do a separate video talking about the experience that I had, why I reacted to the book the way I did. And I would ask you, sir, why is it that I've been able to read books of all different persuasions about the topic of race, but when I get around to this book, suddenly I have this negative, profoundly physically negative response to it? It is not because the book is inherently truthful or that there's some profundity to it. It's because it's structured in such a way that you become terrified. As you read it, you actively become terrified of trying to think. That the only thing you can do is shut down your brain and just start nodding. And that is not how you should go about changing people's minds. That is bullying, and it is indoctrinating behavior. That's all it is. So, and then again, I love the language. This reeks with white fragility. Again, anyone that disagrees, there's no way to disagree and not be a fragile white person. And that is why her views are not academically sound, because they're not falsifiable. And you can't do it. Show me the way to disagree with Robin DiAngelo and not be a fragile white person. And I'm saying for a white person to disagree with Robin DiAngelo and not be a fragile white person. Show me how to do that. And I'm sure that if a black person came along and disagreed with her, you would just say that person had internalized racism or something like that. Anyway, moving forward, let's get into the actual meat and potatoes of this week's discussion.
The time, I began to see what lay beneath this anger and resistance to discuss race or listen to people of color. I observed consistent responses from a variety of participants. For example, many white participants who lived in white suburban neighborhoods and had no sustained relationships with people of color were absolutely certain that they held no racial prejudice or animosity. Other participants simplistically reduced racism to a matter of nice people versus mean people. Most appeared to believe that races ended in 1865 with the end of slavery.
See, this is where an academically rigorous collection of data is important, because she's here just stating purely anecdotally that most of the people she encountered believed that racism ended with the end of slavery, when a cursory glance at U.S. history would indicate that that was not the case. That's a rather mass-level lapse in understanding of our history that needs to be properly documented and proven to have occurred, because our education system is already failing people in many, many ways, but that is a very significant problem if large swaths of the population are coming to the belief that racism ended with slavery.
There was both knee-jerk defensiveness about any suggestion that being white had meaning and a refusal to acknowledge any advantage to being white. Many participants claimed white people were now the oppressed group, and they deeply resented anything perceived to be a form of affirmative action. These responses were so predictable, so consistent and reliable, I was able to stop taking the resistance personally, get past my own conflict avoidance, and reflect on what was behind them. I began to see what I think of as the pillars of whiteness, the unexamined beliefs that prop up our racial responses. I could see the power of the belief that only bad people were racist, as well as how individualism allowed white people to exempt themselves from the forces of socialization.
Now here is where we hit on the idea of individualism being somehow inherently racist in and of itself, or rather a tool used by white people to exempt themselves from racism, etc., etc. So let's dive full force into what she's actually talking about.
These cultural frameworks can be particularly challenging in Western culture precisely because of two key Western ideologies, individualism and objectivity. Briefly, individualism holds that we are each unique and stand apart from others, even those within our social groups. Objectivity tells us that it is possible to be free of all bias. These ideologies make it very difficult for white people to explore the collective aspects of the white experience. Individualism is a storyline that creates, communicates, reproduces, and reinforces the concept that each of us is a unique individual and that our group memberships, such as race, class, or gender, are irrelevant to our opportunities. Individualism claims that there are no intrinsic barriers to individual success and that failure is not a consequence of social structures but comes from individual character. According to the ideology of individualism, race is irrelevant. Of course, we do occupy distinct race, gender, class, and other positions that profoundly shape our life chances in ways that are not natural, voluntary, or random. Opportunity is not equally distributed across race.
Okay, so this is where her definition of individualism becomes logically absurd. She's trying to argue that for individualism to exist, equality would have to exist. And these two forces are fundamentally opposed. They are diametrically opposed. If people were literally 100% equal, completely the same on across every possible dimension of analysis, then individuality would cease to exist because people would be completely assimilated. One would be completely completely undifferentiated from all of the others. And so we're left to conclude that we can have individualism or we can have assimilation. We can't have both. The idea of equality before the bar of law is an artificial standard that is imposed to guarantee the preservation of individual rights. We are not all literally equal. We are not all literally the same. All of us have pluses and minuses naturally and through the cultivation of skills and abilities. So the idea that individualism only exists to the extent that equality exists is completely absurd.
Class and gender. On some level, we know that Bill Gates' son was born into a set of opportunities that will benefit him throughout his life, whether he is mediocre or exceptional. Yet even though Gates' son has clearly been handed unearned advantage, we cling tightly to the ideology of individualism when asked to consider our own unearned advantages.
So what happens here is when you start talking about unearned advantage, you encounter an axiomatic problem, namely that in order for us to hold unearned advantage and unearned privilege and unearned ability, or unearned opportunity, I should say, as a moral negative, we have to hold earned advantage and earned opportunity as a moral gain, a moral positive. So the idea, one immorally gained advantage does not become moral when it is delineated out to another group on the basis of the same immorality. So taking it and saying, okay, this white person had an unearned advantage, now this black person had an unearned advantage, does not make anything better. And that is what happens when they start trying to introduce social programs that are going to balance things out on some kind of even distribution of assets or even distribution of wealth along any lines, whether it's racial or national or religious or gender or what have you. We have to, in order for there to be earned wealth and earned opportunity and earned advantages, we have to recognize that the reality of unearned advantages as being the fellow traveler of earned advantages. What do I mean by that? Bill Gates, she cites the perfect example. Bill Gates makes an insane amount of wealth through his success in free trade, in the voluntary free trade and the free market. And so, yes, he comes away with it with a tremendous amount of money to set up his kids for life. Yes, his kids will never want for anything in their entire lives. That is true. They would have to try. They would have to try so hard to spend through all of that money that they would literally be spending millions and millions and millions of dollars every single day at an inhuman level. And at that point, they would be buying things at such a extraordinary level that if they did run out of money, they could just liquidate all their assets and have all the money again. So they will never want for anything. But you know what? Bill Gates since he retired and since starting the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he has done tremendous amounts of humanitarian work with that money. He has committed himself to reducing and eventually eliminating malaria altogether. He is on the front lines of this COVID-19 crisis, and of course the Ben Garrison loonies of the world think he's secretly trying to implant us with microchips or whatever. But he is doing tremendous humanitarian aid work, to say nothing of the benefit to humanity that has come from the extraordinarily innovative technology that he has delivered unto humanity. Technology, Robin, that you probably used, either that or the technology of Steve Jobs, to create this asinine socialist screed that you are now presenting to the rest of the world. So, for all of that benefit, where he is through the private sector accomplishing things that government, with all of their red tape and all of their bureaucracy and all of their parasitic government professionals cannot accomplish, where he is actually going in and making an actual difference, that is so fucking awesome and so fucking good that I don't care if his kids have unearned advantage. Yes, Bill Gates' children are insanely wealthy. They can go drive their diamond-studded sports cars around the streets of Monaco until the cows come home. I don't care.
Regardless of our protestations that social groups don't matter and that we see everyone as equal, we know that to be a man as defined by the dominant culture is a different experience from being a woman. We know that to be viewed as old is different from being viewed as young, rich is different from poor, able-bodied different from having a disability, gay different from heterosexual, and so on. These groups matter. But they don't matter naturally, as we are often taught to believe. Rather, we are taught that they matter, and the social meaning ascribed to these groups creates a difference in lived experience. We are taught these social meanings in myriad ways, by a range of people, and through a variety of mediums. This training continues after childhood and throughout our lives. Much of it is nonverbal and is achieved through watching and comparing ourselves to others. We are socialized into these groups collectively. In mainstream culture, we all received the same messages about what these groups mean, why being in one group is a different experience from being in another. And we also know that it is better to be in one of these groups than to be in its opposite. For example, to be young rather than old, able-bodied rather than have a disability, rich rather than poor. We gain our understanding of group meaning collectively through aspects of the society around us that are shared and unavoidable: television, movies, news items, song lyrics, magazines, textbooks, schools, religion, literature, stories, jokes, traditions and practices, history, and so on.
Individualism does not mean that we are not exposed to these ideas. Individualism means that we refuse to be inculcated by them. Now, I'm going to put forth a rather controversial opinion, but you know, I figure at this point you wouldn't have gotten this far in the video if you weren't willing to at least hear me out. The problem here, I understand that what Robin DiAngelo is trying to do is set up white people to understand that they have an inherently advantaged worldview that prevents them from understanding what it's like to be black. I know that's where she's going with this. However, I want to talk about the mirror image of that. We talk about how we enter these positions where we can't take one position without incurring the mirror image of that position. We talked about that earlier. And another way that we can't, another message that is therefore produced is the idea that if whites are inherently advantaged, blacks are therefore inherently disadvantaged. And the problem is that without realizing it, Robin DiAngelo is actually lecturing to two groups of people. She's lecturing to white people on what it's like to be white, and black people on what it's like to be black. And part of the problem is that we have created a cultural identity around blackness that is built around viewing yourself as inherently disadvantaged. And the problem with that is that in order to gain cultural adherence, a person has to admit to or glom onto an inherited relevance to experiences that they themselves may not have had. For example, and I'm going to present my own anecdotal argument here, but since we have decided that Robin DiAngelo is somehow exempt from Hitchens' law, I think I can produce my own anecdotal arguments around the same topic, and they are this. When I initially read White Fragility, and I initially started engaging. I went to graduated from, I should say, a predominantly black high school, and so a lot of people that I knew from back in high school that I was re-encountering on Facebook and that kind of thing, had gotten into extremely woke black identity politics, and they were all about this shit. And so one of the things I got, there were two very common responses that I got. I very seldom had anybody actually telling me about actual experiences they went through. These were all, I say kids, obviously they're all adults, many of them with kids themselves now. The overwhelming majority of these people went on to, and contrary to what the guy earlier said, here I'm saying people referring to a group of black people, so no, that term does not inherently mean white people. But anyway, this group of folks and folks is just a colloquial expression. I didn't mean anything by it. I don't know that there is anything to be meant by it. But anyway, these people that I went to high school with, they have all for the most part, gone on to relatively affluent, generally middle-class lifestyles. They've done fairly well for themselves. And that's not surprising because the Atlanta area has long been a hub of black economic prosperity, which we'll get into this more and more later on, but that's one of the reasons I remain incredulous, is it's like, if this situation is impossible to overcome, someone's going to have to explain Atlanta to me. The place that Killer Mike referred to as Wakanda. Anyway, anyway, getting back to my point, what I would get, the response that I would get from these people when I would say, what are tell me about the way this has affected you, usually I get one of two responses. Either the response of, one, it's not my job to educate my white oppressors, which at that point when you're telling me that, I really do think you're just making excuses. But the most common response I would get would be these generalities about, well, you have to understand most black people go through this, or most black people go through this. And again, this was coming from black people that were hoping to educate me. They were saying the same things that white people were saying. You have to understand, most black people go through this, most black people go through this and this and this. Never was I hearing, I as a black person went through this. And that was very interesting to me. And there was a phrase, you talk about all of the phrases, Robin DiAngelo likes to talk about all the phrases that white people throw out to dismiss culpability in all of this. Well, here is a phrase, I would hear this phrase or some variation of it. And that phrase was, as a black person, I have to live with the knowledge that. And that was the oppression. I have to live with the knowledge that. And it would go into something like that. Okay, what that tells me is that, and then we start hearing statistics. You're this % more likely to this. You're this % more likely to this. Okay, what that's telling me is that you're not actually hearing this. You have just accepted this information as part of your identity as a black person. You have let people bestow this knowledge upon you and this information upon you despite having not experienced it yourself. And that's where I start to become skeptical, or what starts to make me skeptical, when over and over again I have people coming to me telling me, here are these statistics, here are these stats and figures, not here's what I went through in my life. Give you an example of something that actually did move me. I have a friend, a professional colleague, who launched his career as a sideman for Little Richard. He's black. My friend, obviously, Little Richard was black. But anyway, he launched his career as a sideman for Little Richard. He said when he went to Europe to tour, for the first time, he said, for the first time in my life, I was not African American, I was just American. And that actually really stopped me and gave me pause. I mean, he didn't intend it. He was not trying to enlighten me. He was just telling me about his experience. But that actually stopped me and gave me pause, because I thought, man, when we that really is like when we say African American, we are putting distance between, we are not acknowledging that these people are American, that they are equally American like the rest of us, that's actually putting distance between them and a positive identity with their country. So that's something that's made me stop and think. And that I can work with. That, if I have actual on-the-ground information, people are actually telling me about their experiences, then there's potentially something I can work with. Now, again, I don't have a lot of patience for microaggressions. The idea of like, I walked into a store and somebody gave me a funny look. Well, people give me funny looks all the time. I mean, there's no way to guarantee that nobody's going to give you a funny look. But something like that, something real, something that actually makes a cognizant difference in my mind, that I can work with. I can't work with this this idea of, oh, well, I have to live with the knowledge that XYZ. No, you don't. That's where the individualism comes in. That's where your individual identity matters. Because then you can say, no, I don't have this experience. No, I'm not being held back in this way. No, I'm not doing a disservice to my fellow black people by refusing to identify as a victim. That is the importance of individualism. So with that covered, let's look at her other major straw man, which is objectivity.
Many of us are unskilled at reflecting on our group memberships. To understand race relations today, we must push against our conditioning and grapple with how and why racial group memberships matter. In addition to challenging our sense of ourselves as individuals, tackling group identity also challenges our belief in objectivity. If group membership is relevant, then we don't see the world from the universal human perspective but from the perspective of a particular kind of human. In this way, both ideologies are disrupted. Thus, reflecting on our racial frames is particularly challenging for many white people, because we are taught that to have a racial viewpoint is to be biased. Unfortunately, this belief protects our biases, because denying that we have them ensures that we won't examine or change them. This will be important to remember when we consider our racial socialization, because there is a vast difference between what we verbally tell our children and all the other ways we train them into the racial norms of our culture. For many white people, the mere title of this book will cause resistance because I am breaking a cardinal rule of individualism. I am generalizing. I am proceeding as if I could know anything about someone just because the person is white. Right now you may be thinking of all the ways that you are different from other white people, and that if I just knew how you had come to this country, or were close to these people, grew up in this neighborhood, endured this struggle, or had this experience, then I would know that you were different, that you were not racist. I've witnessed this common reflex.
So you have fundamentally two groups of people who are part of this discussion. One group of people's lived experiences are relevant to this discussion. The other group of people's lived experiences are inherently not relevant to this discussion. And you draw that distinction along racial lines for the purpose of fighting racism. Got it.
Objectivity tells us that it is possible to be free of all bias. These ideologies make it very difficult for white people to explore the collective aspects of the white experience.
Objectivity is defined as the state of being objective. According to dictionary.com, here are the definitions of the word objective that are relevant to our discussion. Not influenced by personal feelings, interpretations, or prejudice, based on facts, unbiased. Intent upon dealing with things external to the mind rather than with thoughts or feelings as a person or book. Okay, so This is where Robin DiAngelo stumbles hard. She demands that you believe that because you have a subjective perspective, therefore you cannot form an objective argument or modify your perspective based on objective information. So, first of all, objectivity, when we talk about defining something in terms of objectivity, it does require that we modify our subjective perception. If, think about it this way. I mean, there is a huge debate over climate change and global warming right now. If I look out my window, everything looks fine. I cannot perceive climate change. I have to modify my perspective one way or the other based on the information that's garnered from objective facts about how the science of the planet works. There's a meme that goes around on Facebook which shows two guys. It's a cartoon that shows two guys pointing at a number on the ground, and one of them is saying that the number is a 6, and the other one is saying that the number is a 9. And the message always comes with this. The image always comes with some hippy dippy message about how we need to respect each other's different perspectives and learn from one another. Neither one of these people is learning anything based on just how they see the particular number. What they have to do is take a step back and look at where the curb is, which one of them is standing on the street curb, and that is what's going to define whether or not the number is a 6 or a 9. So that's the point. It's not that we don't. The pursuit of objectivity is not something that we automatically arrive at based on our subjective opinion. Indeed, we all do have subjective opinions. The point is that we arrive at the basis of objective fact. What exists objectively, external to our individual perceptions? What is the objective nature of reality? And that is what we have to derive our moral good from, and what we have to determine, what we have to take into account in determining the moral good. And the perfect example of that is in a court of law. Two people go into a court of law. One person is, say, for example, one person is accusing another person of assault and battery or rape or theft or some heinous crime, and the other person is defending themselves, holding themselves up to be not guilty. One of these two perspectives is more in line with the objective nature of reality than the other. What actually happened, and how does it? And how do these two perspectives? Which of these two perspectives is most accurately derived from the objective nature of what happened? So, in the instance of theft, let's say that there is a documented and notarized bill of exchange between two people. If that exists, then that objectively disproves a claim from one person that this person stole it from me. No, you sold it to me. I have the bill of sale right here. And then you would have to prove, and then the onus would be on the person making the claim to demonstrate that bill of sale was either invalid in some way or forged or something like that. We have to work to determine what the objective nature of reality is. That's why we bring in legal professionals, legal scholars, and judges to adjudicate what's actually going on here. Now, I know what you're going to say. These people are not free of their own personal biases and perspectives, and indeed they are not. But that is why we set up as complex a system of checks and balances as we can between the balances of power to try to maintain our overall goal of arriving at objectivity. Do we always do it? No. Is it something we have to work on? Yes. But is it something that we should abandon altogether just because it's difficult? No. It's the basis for all moral good. And what Robin DiAngelo wants you to do when she attacks you for trying to think about things objectively is she is not trying to encourage you to come to a well thought out position. She is trying to put you on the defensive for trying to think at all. She wants you to feel like you are a bigot and a narrow-minded person because you are daring to do something so ostentatious as try to think and try to come to terms with what is actually going on. And, that person I read at the beginning of the video who was saying that I was having physical responses to reading this book because I was somehow being overpowered by the truth of it. No, I live in a society, that is very distinct from places like, say, Soviet Russia and North Korea, and the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. All of these places where collectivism is held up as the greatest good. Yes, I do live in a culture where individualism is held up as the greatest good. Indeed, if individualism was not held up as the greatest good, Robin DiAngelo would not be able to browbeat us because of all of the problems she perceives black people having in trying to attain individualism. So, reading the words of somebody that is trying to challenge my ability to think for myself people don't like it when you tell them that they can't think for themselves. Yes, this is somebody that is trying to make me feel bad for wanting to think for myself. That is why I start to lose my breath. That is why I start to get nauseous. That is why I start to shake when I read this stuff, because I know what she's trying to do. I know the effect that she's trying to have. And that is why we have to argue against this stuff, and we have to put out an intelligent and intellectual response to this claptrap that she is putting forth. Because this is dangerous. This goes far, far deeper than white versus black. This goes far deeper than white privilege or white fragility. What she is advocating for is a level of collectivism predicated on one thing, which is automatic, instantaneous, unquestioned psychological submission. And if you doubt me, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, stop and think that the automatic response to any kind of contradiction to Robin DiAngelo is to automatically accuse you of being a fragile white person. I showed it to you at the beginning of this video, and we're going to keep seeing it as adherents to Robin DiAngelo's philosophy keep showing up. They won't need to do any deeper analysis of what's being said because they've been taught fragile white person shut down immediately. That is what we're dealing with. An automatic mental shutdown button pushed en masse by Robin DiAngelo. Enjoy your weekend.